Good morning and welcome to our life program. Today we are celebrating one of our favorite things in the library world, which is Gulf Coast Reads, where we pick a book that happens kind of in this area or has an interest culturally that's culturally significant to the Gulf Coast area and the people in it. So, this morning we are going to be discussing Gods of Jade and Shadow by Sylvia Moreno, with Regina Vitolo leading the discussion. We're also kind of having a 1920s style Halloween party this morning. And, some of us came in full dress, and if you're not, you're still in spirit with us. We understand. you know. So, Regina, do we want to go ahead and start discussing the book?
Okay, so for those of you who have not read it or do not have a copy, you can see the cover here. And the author is Sylvia Moreno-Garcia, and she lives in Houston, or she may have moved already. She did was in Houston at one point. But this book right here was the Gulf Coast Reads choice, and I'm going to go ahead and read the synopsis since we have a few people here who have not read the book or heard of the book yet. So it's a dazzling fairy tale, a whirlwind tour of a 1920s Mexico, vivid with jazz, the memories of revolution, and gods, demons, and magic. A young woman and a Mayan death god embark on a life-changing journey in this one-of-a-kind fairy tale inspired by Mexican folklore. So I'll just read that so you have an idea of what the book is about. So how many people actually read the book that are here this morning? I did. I'm just curious. Okay, so
Lori says that she's working on it. Oh, look
hi,
at your
Lori.
boa, Lori.
I love your boa. So I do want to, before we start discussing the book, if you are wearing some kind of jazz age or 1920s or costume element, we're going to snap a photo at the end of the meeting, just a screenshot. So be prepared. Okay, so Rachel, if you want to go ahead and pull up the presentation, I'm just going to spend a few minutes on one element of the book.
Sorry about this. I'm taking a second to get us in full screen mode so you can see the slides in all their glory.
Yay, we're at our costume party.
Okay, and just let me know when.
Yeah, okay, so in the book, our main character starts her journey at one end in the Yucatan Peninsula, and then makes her way across Mexico to the California-Mexico border. And we end up, by the end of the story, in Baja California. So I focus on these slides, I'm focused on the inspiration for that setting in the book that the author has discussed in interviews. So if you want to go ahead and advance the next slide. So the setting, okay, we can advance again. So by the end of the book, if you read it, and I don't want to give too many spoilers, again, we end up in Baja California, and our main character, her name Cassiopeia, and the Mayan god that she's traveling with, end up at Agua Caliente in Tijuana. And it's not in the book called Agua Caliente in Tijuana. They're at a some kind of fancy resort in Baja California, but the author's inspiration came from this resort that was built in the early part of the 20th century. So you can see on the left side of the screen, that is a postcard, and you can see people sitting out in a courtyard style area. And this is based off of the Mayan revival architecture that was super popular in the Roaring 20s. Now, on the right, we see a Mayan theater in Los Angeles that was built in around the same time, and it has a lot of the Mayan architectural elements. And when you go back and look at this presentation later, I just want to mention that there are links. These photos are linked to websites where you can see the interior of the Mayan Theater and some other photos of the hotel in Tijuana. But so the story behind the resort, the Agua Caliente in Tijuana, it's interesting. Three auspicious Americans saw a prosperous opportunity for entertainment over the border in Mexico, away from the crippling regulations of prohibition in the USA. So three wealthy speculators cashed in on American prohibition by building this resort right over the border where alcohol was flowing freely. And so three wealthy barons, who were referred to as the border barons, bankrolled the development of Agua Caliente. And it, of course, you can imagine it was a wild time over the border in Prohibition era United States. So this resort is described as Mexico's forgotten Monte Carlo, and it was constructed to capitalize on the waning pleasure industry during American Prohibition. It filled this void, and there were scandalous parties spanning from the late 1920s and early 1930s. And so, as you can see again, it was built in the style of the Mayan Revival architecture, and it's estimated that $10 million were spent on building the resort that we see on the left. And you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So there's on the left here, you can see an old black and white photo of the front. So where you would drive up, or your valet would drop you off, or you would park your car. And then on the right, we have another postcard image. But what characterized the Mayan Revival style or architecture is the red roof tiles and the archways that were meant to evoke an old Mexico by combining Moorish and Spanish details as seen in that other photo of the Mayan Theater that we saw in Los Angeles. Ultimately, with a lot of these buildings that were referred to as Mayan Revival style, their architectural styles ultimately were influenced by mismatched styles, including Art Deco, Mexican Colonial, and Mission Revival style. So I love this style of architecture. And when I think of the 20s or 30s or old Hollywood, there were many homes built in California based off of this Mayan Revival style or Mexican Colonial style. You can advance to the next slide. Okay, so we looked at the resort and the setting, inspiration for our last one of our last scenes in the novel, and now we are going to talk about the people. So the people you would have seen in the 1920s or 30s at a resort like Agua Caliente or right over the border. Now, because it was so close to California and in America, we had prohibition. You had a ton of Americans crossing the border. So this is what Sylvia Moreno-Garcia refers to in some of her interviews as the start of the real boom in border tourism that we see. So we have Americans that are flooding into Mexico to take advantage of the free-flowing liquor and the parties. And you would most likely run into stars like Jean Harlow or Rita Hayworth, John Barrymore, Charlie Chaplin at one of these resorts or bars right across the border. So trips across the border cost people under $1. You could rent a car, pay a driver, have someone bring you across the border for a night of partying and bring you back the next day. So it was convenient and it was relatively inexpensive. And you can imagine the wild time they had. Now, because they were flooded with American tourists, it's really difficult to find old photographs of the locals from that time period. If you find photographs of them, they're in the background working, or they're photographs of workers. So it's really hard to find a photo from one of these resorts and point out someone who would most likely be a local, someone who lived there and was visiting from someplace in Mexico. All right, if you'll go ahead and advance the slide. Okay, so here on the left, there's an old picture of obviously American tourists. Now, if you can see, they are dressed in their riding clothes. Their suits and their dresses do not exactly match the flapper style that we have, that image we have in our mind when we think about partying in Tijuana during the Jazz Age. So I don't know if you can see, if you look up close on the screen, one of the ladies is holding her Mexico banner and the gentleman's leaning up against the car. But a lot of these people that were visiting, going across the border, they had heard stories about what went on there, but they had no idea until they actually got into Tijuana how I guess how scandalous the atmosphere actually was. So, do these people really look like they're going to Tijuana to party? Not to me, but who knows? Maybe once they got there, they changed into their flapper clothes. So here on the right, this was the 1920s Tijuana postcard that I found, the Queens of Tijuana. Now, presumably she is a local or someone from Mexico or Tijuana, and it's a flapper girl or a cabaret girl advertising one of the cervezas beers. So, okay, you can advance to the next slide. And the attire. So go ahead and advance to the next slide here. Now, I pulled these images from a historic fashion site, but I think it's important to reference something that Sylvia Moreno-Garcia brings up in the book, that Mexico, because they had so many American people spilling over the border, they were importing American culture as well. So you would go into Mexico City or Tijuana, and you would be able to hear the latest jazz trios from America or Europe. You would hear those Harlem Renaissance musicians playing on a record. So they were very much receptive to American culture at the time, and that included the dress. So if you went into a cosmopolitan area, if you were again in Mexico City or one of the bars, you were going to see many of the locals dressed in the traditional flapper style fashions that we see here on the photograph. Now, you can see on the men's fashion, they had their day and evening attire, and what you would most likely see is the day suits featured there on the right. If you were going to a resort and say you were going to gamble at Agua Caliente, then you would be required to wear something more like that full tuxedo we see on the left. But yeah, so I found that interesting while studying the fashion, that they were receptive to and imported all of the American fashions and styles, including the music. All right, if you'll go ahead and advance. And here are some more pictures of tourists. I'm presuming some of these are locals, but these are photos of people visiting the Agua Caliente resort. And it's interesting to see the photo on the right. You see women in shorts. We see someone in a sleeveless top. So they're very much embracing, I guess, the freedom of escaping America and all of its restrictions on partying and drinking and dress at this time. All right, if you'll go ahead and advance. Okay, well, before we move on to the discussion questions, sorry, I thought I had one more slide in there. Let's see. I do want to say, so the story takes place just about 10 years after the Mexican Revolution in the 1910. And after the Mexican Revolution, sports, leisure, and numerous entertainments had boomed in Tijuana, providing the perfect ideal for the construction of a getaway for the stylish elite. Booze, prostitution, erotic dancing, and gambling were all coming under moralistic glare in the United States. So at this time, the United States also decided to ban cabaret dancing. So we have stories of a young Rita Hayworth, before she completely modified her look, dancing as a cabaret dancer and at resorts like this, before completely for transplanting to Hollywood. to start her movie career. And saloons and casinos along the Mexican-California border, such as the Sunset Inn, attempted to lure customers with signs in English, promising a taste of quaint old Mexico where you could hear traditional mariachi music and Spanish guitar players. But there were also businesses advertising the newest jazz trios from the United States and Europe. Eddie Rooker, who was a African-American jazz musician, was named one of the highest-priced entertainers in Tijuana. And so Black entertainers were also in high demand over the California-Mexico border at this time. And it's interesting to compare the Texas-Mexico border at this time because, of course, with El Paso and Juarez, we have that same kind of party culture happening over the border, but it was not nearly as diverse as the California-Mexico border at this time. So now, if we want to go ahead and get started on the book discussion questions, does anyone have any comments or any other questions about the little dive into the setting and time period before we advance to that first discussion question?
Okay, so with this, I know that we're commonly taught to see 20s culture as one thing or another. Were there a lot of major differences?
Differences from,
like how people with money would have lived compared to everybody
yes,
else? Because that's one of the things that came up in the book.
That's a great question because Cassiopeia starts with, she has her quaint life off in the countryside, and life, it was night and day. Life in the countryside or a secluded town compared to a cosmopolitan area like Mexico City or a border town. Life was night and day. The dress obviously was different. People dressed modestly. Women were expected to cover up as much as possible and to dress modestly. Skirts obviously were much longer, probably to the ankles. But I think in the story, Cassiopeia makes a comment about having to cover her hair when she goes into town. And this is also something tied into, the religious culture. So there were a lot of difference. For this, I thought we would focus on the party culture in the flapper style, but it was night and day between countryside and then cosmopolitan areas. So are you able to bring the discussion question slides back up?
Yes, I'm just going to really quick, when we do the discussion questions, I'm going to unmute everybody if that's okay.
Oh, yes, that would be great. So, okay. Does anyone want to introduce the main characters or say a little something about our two main characters before we proceed to the discussion questions? I mean, anyone can. No, Rachel, you were talking a little bit about them before we started recording the presentation. Did you want to introduce Cassiopeia, or did you have anything to say about her?
Sure. Cassiopeia starts out as being kind of servile and forced into this life that she hates. And, like they've said in many reviews of the book, she's very Cinderella-esque. But the thing is, over time, she figures out that she's seeking adventure, not necessarily love, but adventure. And that she figures out what she's willing to risk. And she actually gets kind of a taste of the high life before she has to go on that harder journey. So I think there's a lot of feelings of temptation for her. They keep describing her as the Stone Maiden, which I could kind of see that because she does not put up with a lot from the death god that she travels with, because he isn't the most polite individual. He's a little cold, I think, which is really interesting to see that dynamic between how we see Western mythology deities and how the gods in this book behave, but she's very much like, in some ways, I feel like she's a throwback to some of the older parts of the Mayan culture versus like trying to get along with modern 1920s changes.
So I will be honest. It took me a while to get through this book because I am not particularly drawn to Mayan folklore and mythology. It is reading more about it. There are so many similarities to it, interestingly enough, to Dante's Inferno that I found interesting because I had to read that at one point for a class. So I found that interesting. But the Mayan folklore and mythology it's hardcore. If someone were to show up here to the book discussion wearing a costume inspired by one of those gods or the underworld, it would have been true horror style. So I don't know, Rachel, if you delved any more into the Mayan folklore aspect, do you want to give some descriptions?
So she based it on the earliest transcription we have of the document that she based what she was talking about on is called the Popol Vuh. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Mm-hmm. Sorry if I'm not. I'm just going on how it's spelled. And that is actually a really specific to certain regions of Mexico and certain, I guess, subtribe of the Maya that she based it on. And by the way, we do have a waiting list to check out the Popol Vuh on our ebooks. I checked. And it centers on the hero twins and the story that she tells in sort of the passing in the underworld bit of the novel, where she's talking about, okay, the hero twins' mother, the first sort of maiden to come by, has kind of an immaculate conception, if you will, and has the hero twins who overcome some of the death gods in this sort of basketball to the death, if you will, kind of deal. I know, Rick Riordan just came out of my face there. I'm so sorry. But
no, I love the way you phrased that.
I would have never thought of that. Yeah. Do you want to explain how the hero twins, how that part of the mythology features in this story, how she uses
so them? The hero twins were the first two people to kind of take on some of the death gods in the Popol Vuh and in this novel. And it's just sort of mentioned in passing during one of Cassiopeia's I'm about to take this long, dark road to the city of hell journey to see if I can, buy us redemption and hopefully not make the underworld a horrible place for everyone. And correct me if I'm wrong, and feel free to jump in if you have other descriptions of the book. But the hero twins get into this, like I said, kind of a ball game to the death with the death gods 1 and 7. So there's 1 death and 7 deaths, which are these two brothers, and takes them on and kind of makes a bet with them that they can beat the death gods. And eventually the hero twins do, because that's part of their shtick is, we are these children of this wronged prince, basically, who managed to die and somehow get our mom, us, and we want revenge on this death god, so we're going to have it. And they overcome this death god in this long ball game to the death and sort of become a really big central figure in Mayan mythology. This all being said, I am not a Maya scholar. A lot of this came from looking at Wikipedia. Figure out what was going on, and we've read other books with Mayan mythology. So my partner and I, who both read the book, were kind of going, wait a second, there's different Maya death gods that we know of. What's going on here? You know, we're crossing paths, and we figured out, oh wait, she's basing this on really specific, the regions that they travel to pick up his body parts. They're also the same regions where the tribes or groups of people, if you will, who were part of that subsection of the Maya who stuck to the Popol actually lived. It's
So-
just harder to read them because they're still in the 1500 script transcription, Jane. So, and apparently the priest or missionary dude who did them kind of watched some of the translation.
And the author, just to point out, does include an afterword. It tells you a little bit about the Mayan mythology and a glossary. So as you're reading this, you're going to come across many names or words or people that you can flip back to the glossary and look up, so you know what you're what it is as you're reading. But so we have one of the hero gods, hero twins. One of them eventually is Cassiopeia's love interest by the end of the story, or romantic interest, which it's something very brief. And I thought that was interesting that the author decided to, like, we're reading about all of this death and doom while Cassiopeia is going through her journey in the underworld. And then we have this glimmer of a romance develop between I forgot his name, her Mayan god. But I felt like Hunkame, was it? Yeah. So did anyone feel like that was out of place? Did anyone think the story would have been better with that left out, that aspect? Did it feel contrived, or?
I mean, I feel like it was kind of bound to happen. You know, I feel like they definitely started off as more of like a buddy comedy sort of thing, you know, like a road trip duo thing, which I liked. And I really liked that sort of rom-com element because it felt like it added more stakes to the story. But I don't know if you can see Penny here. I felt like it added more stakes to the story, you know, because then they had to make these choices about staying mortal or not, or like entering the final showdown with Martine, that they might not have made if they hadn't had that, you know, beginning of a romantic sort of thing. And who knows if she, you know, without giving anything away, who knows if she would have made that final decision she did in the underworld if she didn't have that love for him. So I was on board with it.
Okay. It did very much have the feel of a 1920s or 30s romantic comedy film, which another layer to it that you bring up. So I thought that was interesting. I didn't know how I was on the fence about it. I think part of the reason was I felt like Cassiopeia was so young, and we have, you know, Hunkame over here who is like really old. But
there's an age gap.
But when she describes him, she multiple times she mentions that he seems ageless. She doesn't, you know, you can't really put an age on him. So he seems really young at moments. Other moments he seems older. So I mean, I guess it works. Yeah, it works. Rachel, do you want to pull up the discussion question slides now? And we can follow along through those. But did anyone else, before we pull that up, have any other comments if you read the book? Overall impressions of the book, if you were able to read the entire thing? I know, Lori, you nodded in agreement when you said it was difficult to get through the book. Did you try to read it and not finish?
Yeah, well, I got to the underworld discussion parts, and I'm like, it just doesn't. I liked the beginning because I was seeing her as a young girl and listening to her mama doing what she's told and all that, and I lost myself. This is not a book I normally read.
Right. I mean, a lot of those fantasy elements can be hard to follow, or the mythology. So I definitely understand that. So our first discussion question, and this is from the book club kit put together by the publisher. So many of the questions are multi-part questions, but we kind of already discussed this. What were your first impressions of Cassiopeia, Hunkame, Martine, and then how did you feel about them by the end of the book? So here we want to point out that Martine is Cassiopeia's cousin, who is her older male cousin who is always giving her grief. He's demanding, and he treats Cassiopeia like a servant, and there are some, if someone wants to help me with this, there are some, I think, bloodline issues. I don't know if someone's more of one family that's revered than the other.
Yeah, it has to do with the conflict between it's basically a caste system that they're dealing with that existed under the Spaniards and the Hacienda system. I think where Martine is very much, I am descended from the Spaniard side of the family, but Cassiopeia's father is of the Mayan descendancy, from what I got from the book. And thus, she receives a lot of criticism and a lot of crap, honestly, from Martine, because to him that makes her seem lower, which when she first meets Hunkame, she gets that little bit of a surprise that he keeps calling her Lady Tun, Lady of Stone. And she's like, wait a minute, I'm not a lady. Literally, I ended up waiting on people for most of my life. And he looks at her like, yeah, no, there's been a whole revolution here. You are a lady if I say you are. Right. And he actually says that a couple of times. So I think it's interesting that Martine tries to cheat on the journey, but he still loses, which that's one of the few aspects that I was a fan of. Because Martine does not embody a gentleman in many aspects.
No, but we end up liking him a little bit by the end because he's not able to go through with eliminating Cassiopeia for, killing her off. So that made him, and by the end of the story, they kind of make good. So that made him a little more likable by the end.
I've always felt, and really almost since the beginning of the book, I felt mostly like sympathy and pity for Martine, because it was so clear to me that the enemy, I guess, the bad guy, is their grandfather, because he's terrible to both of them. And so they're really kind of victims of the grandfather, but just different side of the coin. So that moment where his grandfather looked at him, after he got kicked out of school, and his grandfather said, "Oh, you should have been born a girl." You really kind of felt, bad. I felt bad for both of them. And he was just kind of like trying to make the best out of a bad, he was a pawn first of his grandfather and then of the other, I forget who, Vulcame, whoever Hunkame's brother was. So I felt pretty bad for him throughout the whole thing.
When we learn about more of his backstory and about his relationship with his grandfather and compared to Cassiopeia's relationship with her grandfather, yeah, I mean, it made me sympathetic towards him. So, and he is very much the pawn in this story, because as he's going through like completing these tasks, we even hear him, he comments like, okay, I'm just doing this because someone's expecting this or telling me to do this. He doesn't know if he necessarily wants to be doing anything that he's doing. So yeah, I totally sympathize with Martine. And I think I even sympathized with the other hero twin, the other death god, which I think you said it was something. Was it
Vulkame.
Vulkame? Yeah. So I even ended up sympathizing or liking his character by the end of it. Did anyone experience that? Because he was kind of just playing his role as one of the death gods and doing what death gods do, like competing for the throne. So I mean, I don't know. I think at the end of it, I know Hunkame decides not to finish off his brother to kill him. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, you are. They decide to kind of thrown up as equals because Hunkame's learned from humanity that it sucks to be the little guy. And on sort of the bottom of the hierarchy, if you will.
Right. So even Hunkame's experience in the mortal world and the feelings he's developed for Cassiopeia have somewhat softened him or made him feel sympathy for his brother. And I liked that aspect of the story at the end of it. So
yeah, that was kind of the nice thing about this. There weren't really any real villains other than the grandfather, you know.
That's a good point. He was the main villain of the story. He set everyone the ball rolling.
I thought that guy who ran whatever the place that was the real life Agua Caliente, what was it, Tierra Blanca or something? I thought the guy that ran that and was trying to like move the underworld back to
I forgot
blood
about
and sacrifice. I thought that guy was also a villain, more so than Bunkame.
Okay, I completely forgot about that. Yeah. I didn't
What was
think
that
about
guy's name? I forget what that guy's name was, but
I don't remember what his name was either, but yeah. And then there was the other character, the poison ivy type character. I forgot to mark her name, but she tried to ensnare Unkame and foil his plans.
Yeah.
And she was like a villain in the story.
She was kind of like a minor boss. Like I kind of thought of this like a video game, right? They had different bosses they were defeating until they got to the big boss at Tierra Blanca.
Exactly. That's how this book read. And I think there's a discussion question. We can go ahead and advance to the next one that asks like, how does this story work? Like how would this work in I don't know, if another format, or maybe it was a question that I read somewhere else, but you hit the nail on the head with that. I was thinking of a video game and like bosses as I was reading it. Yeah, that's it. That's a good analogy. Okay. How did you feel about the relationship? Oh, well, we covered this. We already discussed the relationship between them. So 3, what did you think about the historical period and setting of the book? Could you see this as a modern day adventure? Well, we could see this as modern day like graphic novel or video game, but I absolutely loved the historical period and setting. As we have a tendency to do, go down the rabbit hole when we're researching stuff. I love reading about the Mexican Revolution and then up until 1960s Mexico. It's so fascinating, but the time period, everything she evoked with her descriptive writing, I absolutely loved it. So I'm curious to know what everyone else thought about that aspect of it. And then, of course, we can touch on the underworld.
I liked that there were these 2 separate worlds and that we got a very different glimpse at the 1920s than Gatsby because, oftentimes we see the 20s as like one type of thing when really it was a really big time of transition and change everywhere. So getting to see this as, something, I think honestly one of the things that I thought about the most was Cassiopeia's different outfits. she received, the first outfit was kind of stepping into the corsetry and all the old-fashioned clothing that was still somewhat in vogue. And then by the time we're done with it, she's in, a full flapper dress with the short hair and all the accessories that you could ever possibly want.
It was, an interesting progression for her character. Sure. I liked that.
I thought it was, just perfect for the book because, as Rachel just said, it was such an enormous time of transition. So I thought it really mirrored so well the transition and the transformation in Mexico of the pre-revolution and the modern, but also mirroring, Cassiopeia's transition into womanhood. I thought that whole, it was just perfect. And then, of course, as y'all say, the aesthetic is just, the costumes and picturing the temple and the deco and stuff was great. Do either of you know if the movie rights have been optioned for this? Like, I can't see them not turning this into a movie. You know what I mean?
So I haven't read, I was looking online and I think we brought this up at one point, but Mexican Gothic was, optioned a while back for...
In the middle of reading that right now.
Right, for a limited Hulu series. And if anyone is looking for another Sylvia Moreno-Garcia book to try, if you are not into the whole Mayan mythology aspect, Mexican Gothic is fabulous, and it's set about 30 years later, but it is just atmospheric. There's a real cinematic vibe to it, and it's dark, but it's fascinating, and I recommend that. So if you want to try something that this author has written, but this doesn't sound like your cup of tea, place Mexican Gothic on hold and read that before it comes out as a series on Hulu. I'll keep checking to see if this is going to be optioned. When you think about this going into a film or limited series format, gosh, the budget they would have to have for this if they were really going to stay true to the book. I feel like it would be like a big budget feature. But
the car alone.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's interesting too during this time period because we're seeing a lot of Mexico was so diverse, not just at the border, but there are so many exiles from Russia and Cuba and Chile coming into Mexico. And so it was, you can just imagine how interesting the conversations at these bars and speakeasies were in Mexico at the time. So I love this. I love reading about this period and reading about this period, not in New York or in America, but in Mexico. Yeah. Okay, so next discussion question. What did you think about the ending? Do you wish anything had been different? Would you read a sequel to this story? If so, would you prefer it feature Cassiopeia and Huncame, or would you prefer a story in the same world with new characters? Okay, I'm going to be the first person to answer part of this. We discussed the ending a little. I liked the ending, but I do not know if I would be able to read a sequel to this story or if I would be interested in it. If there was less of the underworld featured, say Huncame decided he missed Cassiopeia so much he had to completely turn mortal or come back to the mortal world, maybe I would read it. So for me, the most compelling parts of the story were reading about the historical, the culture and the settings. So I could honestly do without, like Lori, without all of the Mayan folklore. But I do love how the author interweaved those stories.
I guess I wanted more about the culture of the I'm thinking when we went back into Mexico and stuff, and you see those temples and everything, I like stories about what actually went on there. Why were they there? And I was expecting a little bit of that. It just got a little dark in there, and I just couldn't follow it.
A lot dark.
I guess I like the real stuff to the fiction stuff.
Right. That makes sense.
I
Anybody else?
would definitely read a sequel. I have to say, I really liked the whole underworld, quantifying, anthropomorphizing gods. Like, I love that. I loved American Gods by Neil Gaiman. So I'm really into that element of it. I would definitely want to read a sequel, but I think I would like that sequel to be set like 20 or 30 years in the future. And Cassiopeia is maybe coming back and after all her adventures. And so I would like it to focus more on like Cassiopeia and Martine, but older and sort of maybe reminiscing on their adventures and how they've changed maybe.
Right. That's interesting. Right. Because at the very end of the story, Cassiopeia, she doesn't go back to her old life. She goes on an extended adventure. So it's definitely set up to where we could see a sequel happening. But from the interviews I've read with the author, she doesn't have anything planned as of yet for a sequel. But who knows, maybe after its popularity from being featured, if there's more interest, then it's something that we could see happen. Okay.
The ending was hard for me. I'm going to be honest with that. The very end was great. And honestly, I just want a novel about the adventures of Cassiopeia because I feel like she'd go on some pretty awesome adventures. Glenna also said that she agreed with Lori about struggling with some of the fantasy versus historic reality aspects, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, some of the descriptions, some of it can be so abstract and hard to visualize, but a lot of it was it's really dark, and so you kind of have to be in the right mindset, I guess, to read it. Okay, so next question, I think that was the last question because we had already answered a couple of them, but or no, you already progressed the slide. Okay, discuss Martine's perception of the world versus Cassiopeia's. Why do you think, raised under the same roof, they see things so differently? And Jane touched on this. Yeah, Jane touched on this earlier too.
Exactly what Lori just said, right? It's machismo. It's the gender. That's that whole thing.
Yeah.
He's the only boy in the family, so he's like the golden child, except he's not because he's an idiot.
Right. And
okay,
and so well, I was going to say, and that's the author has several instances where that's brought and we're made aware of the cultural the differences between how life treats you if you're born male rather than female, and I think that's another aspect of the book that she's not heavy-handed with it, but it just lets you know how culturally how it was there and how machismo and the gender stereotypes were entrenched in their culture as well. So I think that was interesting.
Okay. If it's all right, I'm going to stop sharing the slides now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And just take us back into us just discussing things and kind of hanging out. Like I said, I really enjoyed the fashion culture and getting to see some of the glitz and glam and some of the difference between country and city. I think was really fun.
There were so many different aspects of this book you could focus on to do a presentation on our research. It would have been overwhelming if you tried to cover and present on everything. So for me, focusing on the border resort and the kind of party culture, looking into that and seeing how you had Americans flooding the border and bringing culture with them and influencing. I that's just, it was all super fascinating to dive into and read more about. But now maybe I will go and when I have time, read more about the Mayan folklore and mythology, especially because even on the University of Houston campus, there are murals depicting scenes from the same Mayan folklore and texts. So it's interesting.
I guess the writer Elizabeth Peters, she does those the pyramids and all that. I love that writing, and it seems to be accurate with her descriptions of how the ancient stuff when they find something.
Oh, right.
That author I read every one of her books. I was hoping this one might have any type of connection to the Mexico and the culture, and I just that was a little dark one. And I don't know enough about it to know if it has the true aspects of real stuff that happened back then. The temple, why they were built, the stuff inside. I don't know enough about it. Maybe, like you said, Regina, I need to read up a little more on the mythology of that.
It sounds like you're interested in learning more about Mayan culture in general and the architecture and the real stuff rather than their myths and folklore. Right. But I mean, Sylvia Moreno-Garcia, she is a meticulous researcher, and she's also an anthropologist. So all of her descriptions and the things the realistic parts, they are all, on point. She's accurate and does her research. So.
I don't know. I kind of really enjoyed, my favorite part of it was 4 different bosses and then sort of the big boss, as Jan said. Like the idea that every piece of him he gets back, we have to meet someone new from this dark sort of gothic underworld style of thing. And they really do seem like comic book villains to me. And that's not a criticism because I'm an enormous comic book fan and I've been reading them since God knows when. But you could definitely archetype these with a lot of the sort of fantasy villains. I did like the last villain, sort of swanky, slinky 1920s palace. It's someplace that I could see the 2 ladies from Chicago renting kind of at the end of the film.
I mean, I just want to say there's another book that if you are into this like historical fiction, historical or fantasy crossover, there's a book called In Love and War or Love and War, and it's set it uses Greek mythology and then World War, I think it's World War II. Could be World War I. So, and I just forgot the author's name, but maybe we can put that in an email following up. But that is one of my top reads in the past 2 years, and it's written by a young adult fiction writer, and it's classified as young adult fiction, but I think if you are interested in history and you like the melding of mythology with history, you would love the book. A Lovely War. That's what it's called. Lovely War. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was on my list.
Yes, it's great read. But does anyone have any closing thoughts or feels about the book? I will say I haven't rated this on Goodreads yet, but with stuff that I wasn't into with the Mayan folklore aside, I would definitely have to, on a scale of 1 to 5, would rate this probably a solid 4.5.
Yeah, it was beautifully written and it had great flow.
Mm-hmm.
So, the sort of lyricalness of writing, I felt like helped make the darkness a little less harsh.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what I love about the Gulf Coast Reads picks, though, because sometimes they introduce you to books that you would never otherwise read. So I like that aspect of it too. I don't know that I would have picked that one up, Mexican Gothic 100%, but I do recommend reading that next if you enjoyed her writing style. So
Jane's saying 4.5 or 5 stars. She really loved it, including all the folklore bits. I was a fan of the folklore bits too, actually. Sometimes more than the real, the realistic part. I love me some good mythology and some good folklore. So we've read a lot of the Rick Riordan Presents series lately, just trying to keep up with that. And it's a lot of different writers from around the world and different cultures of mythology. But this was kind of a real departure for that, to get to see mythology taken in this dark turn to this adult genre art audience was really actually something that I really enjoyed.
yeah, well, I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Alrighty, guys. So
for
thank
those
you
of
so
you,
much.
sorry, one moment. So Jane, Rachel, for those of you who have, Lori, any type of, costume element, if you are okay with taking, we could take a screenshot, or if you are okay with taking a selfie at home and then sending it to us via email so we can feature on our social media, that might be even better, since the screen is kind of like, I don't know how you see it, but I see like a bunch of cameras turned off and then a row. So if you're okay with sending a selfie of yourself with your costume element for us to put on social media, we can do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys, for those of you who came out this morning, and hopefully you will get to enjoy and read our Gulf Coast read for this year. And we appreciate you guys joining us for our 20s party, especially those of you who dressed. You all look fabulous. And to those of you who we can't see, we're just, we know what appropriate 20s attire looks like now, so we're going to assume that you were there with us, at least in spirit. So that is definitely appreciated. Thank you very much to Regina Vitolo. Yes, we're assuming that you're all in full suits on the other end of that camera. So if we could just, do some zoot suit pictures there for the snapshot, that would be great. Thank you very much for everyone who joined in the discussion. Like I said, it's been real fun, and I haven't been to a book discussion in a little bit, so it's nice to be able to talk with other people, virtually we are, about books and literature and get some different takes. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much to Regina Vitolo for all of her knowledge and her research into Mexican culture and fashion, and
well, thank you all.
Thank you in the 1920s.
Thank you and Jane for your contributions on the Mayan folklore side. Yeah, so
the postcards were really fun. I'm gonna have to put that up next to this so that people can see the postcards in their full glory of, getting to see what this
thank you, Glenna.
Sort of swanky place looked like at that time. Thanks so much, Glenna. And Dee says she's still reading. She's definitely gonna finish it.
Oh, nice.
And that Regina makes everything sound interesting. I can agree with that. So get interested and check out our Gulf Coast read. And if you want to review this and kind of relook at some of the slides or some of the discussion, we will be posting it to our YouTube and to the live page as well. As well,
I link to several sources at the end on that slideshow. So if you want to dive deeper onto any of those images or things we discussed, check that out.
Yes, awesome. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for joining us and for giving us a wonderful discussion, Regina.
Thank you.